and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in business and future affairs, market watch, industries, analysis and insights. We've got you covered right here on Niaga Spotlight. Well, this week on analysis, we are looking at Malaysia's gender pay gap and how this negatively impacts national economic development. So January has been a month of headlines about our national priority for the year, reducing cost of living. In line with that, the Madani government is committed to rationalizing subsidies, implementing wage reforms, reducing housing costs, breaking up monopolies. But there is scant attention for a deeply concerning number, which does in fact impact cost of living, Malaysia's gender pay gap. Now, interestingly enough, the Department of Statistics, DOSM, reported in mid-December 2023 that in the previous year, women on average made a total income of 42,080 ringgit, compared to men at 62,117 ringgit in 2022. In other words, for every 100 ringgit in salaries and wages received by men, women only received 66.67 ringgit. This is also a pronounced decline from women earning 96 ringgit for every 100 ringgit men earned in 2021. So according to these DOSM statistics, Malaysia then clocks a 33.33% gender pay gap in 2022. Once again, a startling increase from DOSM's reported 4% GPG in 2021. This Niaga Spotlight discussion focuses on strategies to actionably address the gender pay gap and how this is in fact crucial for national economic development. Joining me in the studios now are Dato' Ong Bileng, CEO of Penang Women's Development Corporation, PWDC, Dr. Saizi Xiao, who is Assistant Professor with the School of Economics at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, and of course, Amelia Sharif, who's Managing Partner with Speak Up Malaysia. Very good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for making time to join us. And Dato' Bileng, all the way from Penang, actually. So let's get the discussion started off, and I would like to propose this first question to Dr. Saizi. So why should we be concerned about the gender pay gap, and especially about the wider impacts on the Malaysian economy, competitiveness, national development? Let's frame it properly for once.
I think generally equality and also fairness is always one of the key topics that we should concern about, because when we're talking about shared prosperity, we have to make sure, try to narrow down the gap not only between women and men, and also for rural and urban residents as well. But we're concerned about the gender pay gap is more about economic consequences. On the national level, in economics, we always talk about productivity and efficiency.
Sure.
We have to ensure that we have a more diversified and also inclusive gender-balanced labor force to help to boost for our productivity improvement, and also try to make sure our labor market returns are based on the qualification, skills, contribution instead of the gender itself. And also when we're talking about the individual level, don't forget about women and the babies are always the biggest consumers for the country and also for the global economy. So in terms of the consumption, it has been always one of the key drivers for the economic growth as well. Yeah, I think we also talk about the human capital investment as well. So if the women feel like there has been always been downpaid, so they will slowly reduce their investment on the human capital. So also this can be a very serious issue for not only for the existing labor market, but also for our future labor market, because if the mother decided to reduce their own education investment, which means in the future, the quality of our future labor force could be reduced as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for setting those parameters. We'll go much deeper into the consumption and the other side of things, especially regarding education attainment of Malaysian women in a bit. Dr. Saizi, first though, what are the actual global methodologies or the best standards that economists, statisticians use for calculating the gender pay gap?
Okay, in terms of the calculation, I think we have two parts. Number one is when we're defining the pay, the wages, the salaries, how do we define that? Are we using the annual income, or are we using the hourly income, which take into the consideration about the difference in working hours between women and men? Or when we are talking about the definition of the wages, the salaries, women who are working in the informal sector are usually being left out. So secondly is when we're doing the calculation, globally there are different ways. The most, the direct way is to compare the average, which we call the mean wages between women and men, or the median level of the wages between women and men, which is taken into the consideration of the income distribution. But there are some of the more advanced, the more mature methodology which they take into the consideration about the difference of the working hours and also the structure of the labor market, which we call the adjusted gender pay gap.
Right.
Yes, and of course, we also define the gender pay gap into different of the quantiles, which means we compare women who are sitting at the management level of their income versus men, and also sometimes we're comparing the gender pay gap for those lower paid industries as well.
Understood. Now, what could be then the possible driving factors behind the market increase and decreases in Malaysia's GPG between 2020? It clocked in at about 7%. 2021 went down to 4%. And 2022, the current statistic that has been published by DOSM, 33.33%.
I think that's a really 33% is really a shocking figure to me as well. But I think it more depends on the methodology or the data that it has been used to do the calculation. If we use the monthly collected data from the Salary and Wages Survey of Malaysia done by DOSM, we can see the gap has been increased for about 4% to about 7.7% during the last 3 years. But no matter what kind of data source you are using, you still see an increase in gender pay gap during the post-pandemic period. I think there are a couple of the reasons. First of all, during the post-pandemic period, there are more women has been losing their jobs compared to men, especially in some of the key industry in Malaysia, like such as the tourism industry, and also due to the increased family care responsibilities. So women has no choice but to left from their jobs and go back to the have family to take care of the babies and also the family members as well. But I think there are another important reasons about the structural changes of our labor market and also industry. We can see that we are now entering into a more digital era. So there are more digital-based, technology-based jobs are offering, which are they're producing higher paid jobs, opportunities as well, which means in terms of the skills, qualifications, men are more equitable with this kind of the skills and qualifications. So in that way, women has lower chance to get into this market as well.
Correct. And also, of course, we've seen all the latest statistics that show that particularly the tech industry, women drop out, even highly qualified professionals, by the age of 35. Thanks very much for setting the tone for that, Dr. Saizi. Now, Dato' Ong Bileng, can we go into a little bit of more granular information about PWDC's perspectives and any recent insights when it comes to the women's labor force and also perhaps even the gender pay gap when it comes to Penang?
Okay, thank you, Tamina. So as we know, it really sort of sent a shockwave to everyone, those who are actually monitoring where is the gender equality, where are we, over these years. So getting a 4%, because we have been talking and we have been even communicating with a lot of stakeholders to say that, gender pay gap is not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is actually in the labor force participation rate. So that is the part that we were looking at, how do we then close the gap? Typically the man is 80%, women is at 55% and all that. So we were looking at how do we want to narrow this gap. However, with this, I think our work then have to shift a little bit more to go into the next level. It's not just the labor force participation rate, but how are they, in terms of getting the pay. So for one, we have been monitoring the labor force participation rate, and especially for female, we find that typically they will go up until the age of 30, and there's a dip, a very drastic dip. And if you look into it further, you'll find that at the age of 30 to 34, that's where the dip is. So that if you look at it, why did it happen that way? It's because at that point, women starts their family. And most of the time, between a man or the husband and the wife, most of the time it's actually the wife who take a step back from work and resign from work. So that is actually where the dip is. And I think importantly is that knowing the dip, so that's where PwC is also looking at how do we then mitigate this issue.
Sure.
And childcare is actually typically one of the critical enabler for women to stay in the workforce. So in other countries, we see a double peak. but not in Malaysia. It's a single peak and it's down all the way most of the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what's also not perhaps happening then, Dato, which perhaps we can interject with, is that corporations, organizations, regardless of whether they're government related, or the private sector, perhaps they do not have the mechanisms in place to ensure that once women are perhaps even more available to come back into work, because we cannot be waiting forever for the affordable, equitable childcare structure to be put in place. So let's say once perhaps your child is 7, 8 years of age, you want to come back into the workforce. Any kind of trainings, etc., that you have noticed, especially corporations in Penang offering to women wanting to come back to work and pick off from where they left off in their early 30s?
Yeah, very good question. In fact, at the federal level, through Talent Corp, they actually have come up with programs, especially returning women. Okay, it is an initiative involving also the companies and all that, looking at tax incentive. Also there is a package where the government is actually even incentivizing in terms of paying for the women to come back. However, to me, more importantly is how do we retain them? Because if we lose them from the workforce, it is very difficult for women to come back. Yeah, many factors. For one, you are so used to the 6-7 years before the child goes to school. You are so used to this lifestyle where everything is circled around the child. Okay?
Very true.
So one is a personal challenge. Second is that at what point do they come back? Because you have left the workforce for the few years, you may come back and say, hey, no, I have to report to my junior. So these are some of the challenges, as well as even for a company, where do I put you now?
Those are the real life lived experiences.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Dato. Amelia, moving the conversation along now to a wider perspective on why exactly economic equity and also reducing the gender pay gap is actually fundamental for women's empowerment.
When we talk about gender gap and in particular economic equity, we are looking at fair distribution of opportunities, wealth, assets and resources between the genders at the workforce. So the biggest benefit is women achieving economic independence. And the reason economic independence is just so important is because it will empower almost every aspect of the woman's life. And this is true not just for women, this is true for literally anyone. The moment you have economic independence, therefore it improves several aspects of your life. I want to touch on 3.
Sure.
The first one is it will greatly improve your decision-making power. So if you're a woman and you have the ability to earn and you are independently earning and you're independently that means you are independently able to make decisions in your life. You are able to make choices based on really what you want, as opposed to perhaps being influenced to things like traditional gender roles, perhaps what your family wants, or perhaps what your society wants you to do. So economic independence allow you to break free from certain patterns that we've seen in the past. And more importantly, the International Labour Organization has noted a positive correlation between women's economic independence to improved decision making in households. That means in a household, when women are also earning and they are also independent, it contributes to more equitable decision making. For example, things like deciding which child gets to further their education, on decisions like household savings, household expenditures on a monthly basis. There's actually a positive correlation between the two. The second thing I want to touch upon is savings and long-term financial security. So with almost 33% or so the number that we're working with right now, when they earn less, that means women are generally less able to have savings, not just for emergencies, but also to sustain life post-retirement. We've heard economists talk about old age poverty, which is something that a lot of people are worried about because we are not earning enough, not saving enough to be able to afford life post-retirement. So put that in a context where women are actually earning less, therefore they will have less income. That means less savings. So women are actually more prone to things like old age poverty, right? So this means that if you put it into context, in the long run, it means that the government will have to spend more money to sustain on things like welfare, to support the life of, older women and things like that.
And women also live an average of about 5 years more than Malaysian men.
That's correct.
77 versus 72 for men.
That's correct. So if we're just able to kind of like shift the tide a little bit, we could actually save on later in terms of government spending on this area. And the last part, and most obviously, is improved well-being and quality of life. Harvard Business Review did a study that shows that when women are more economically independent, they become more healthy, not just physically, but also in terms of their mental health. So it means that the biggest point that I want to make here is when women are healthier and happier, there's also a direct correlation to the quality of life of those that are within their household, and that also transcends to the quality of life of those within their communities. So when you empower women, you empower families and you empower communities. So it is actually extremely lucrative to increase the gender pay gap right now because of the long-term benefit to our economy.
Exactly, and I think this is something that is a little bit of a hidden narrative because we just look at gender pay gap as an isolated issue when in fact it has ramifications for every area of the national economy and development as well. Thank you for that. Dr. Saizi, now moving into the fact that of course the Madani government has been very forthcoming, it's also targeting increasing women's LFBR from roughly about 56% of a national average to 60%, so saying within about 10 years. But at the same time, there are a lot of regional variations across the country. Terengganu, for example, clocking in lowest with only a 41.9% female LFBR. So what are some of the main factors? Let's dig deeper into why we are seeing these lower female LFBR rates, despite the fact that year on year, women's education attainment, higher education is actually improving. It's skyrocketing.
Yes, I think, Tamina, you highlighted a very important point, which is why women are more educated but has been less employed and also been less paid. I think just now Dato mentioned a very important reason because the lack of the childcare support, this which has been one of the general reasons has been identified by many of the studies, not only for Malaysia but also for many other developing countries. But also I think another important reason is because if we break the labor market into two parts, which is before you entering into the labor market or after you have been in the labor market. If we are looking at the youth labor force participation rate for Malaysia, so women and men, which means about 40% versus 50%. So the gap is still about 10%. So which means you can see the problem comes from the after women has been already in the labor market. Also has been commented by Dato just now, which means you can see in Malaysia, if you look at the labor force participation rate for women across the whole different of the age cohort, you can see the labor force participation rate increased after they finish the higher education, then decline significantly once they're entering into the marriage and also childbearing. But the problem is, how can we help them to make them re-employed? So which means in many of the developed and developing countries, especially in Asia Pacific, we see there are two peak trend. But in Malaysia, unfortunately, there's only single peak. So which the problem is, once women quit from the labor market and going back home to take care of the baby and also the family responsibility, how can they come back to be re-employed? So I think that's one of the key drivers. And also don't forget about the gender pay gap. Since women has been always segregated to those lower paid jobs, which means this pulling factor has been very weak because with this lower level of the wages, so women's intention to be employed to get a job might become lower as well.
Exactly. And talking about, of course, the burden of childcare, I am thinking about the wider responsibilities for unpaid care work that tend to disproportionately fall on women's shoulders. Dr. Saizi, any perspectives also taking into account that, of course, globally and also Malaysia-wise, we are now an aging society. So unfortunately, once again, the gendered care work burdens for elderly care, convalescent care, then once again falls on female shoulders. So prospectively speaking, would it be accurate to perhaps say that women who have, in that sense, finished the childcare duties and the responsibilities for the earlier part when their children are very young, they then get quite immediately thrown into the burdens of caring for elderly parents, perhaps from both sides of the family, right?
Yes, I think one of the solutions could be, so we try to narrow down the gender parental leave gaps as well. So in Malaysia, so we have about 98 days for women, for the mother, and 7 days for the father. But globally, on average, for women is about, the maternity leave is 191 days. For men are 21 days for parental leave. So I think if we can have more flexible arrangement for the moms once they have to go back home to go through the childbearing and taking care of the babies, and also the elderly people, if we can have more flexible and more generous like a arrangement for them, I think would be a very good way. So if we look at the global practice, so we can see like Malaysia, in terms of the days for maternity leave and also parental leave are still far behind from many of the countries. The second thing I think we can do is about when we're talking about how can we better help the women, the first thing we should think about is the financial support. So it's that we can propose a gender responsive budget. So we should move from a gender favorable budget into a gender equitable budget. So we're not only talking about how much money have we been provided and allocated for the women to improve their skills and the qualification, but also we should talk about the resources and the budget we have been planned for. It has been fairly distributed between women and men or not. For example, like in Canada, which they have already implemented this gender equitable and also gender responsive budget for many years ago. So now when we're looking at the gender pay gap, it's about 88 versus 100. So you can see the gap for the gender pay gap is quite small. And in terms of labor force participation, the gap is also less than 8% as well.
So it's really progressed well because of these mechanisms. Yeah. And I also, of course, would like to quickly highlight that, yes, the Ministry of Economy needs to take a leadership role in this, especially considering that you have your annual budgets that are coming out. It has to be gender responsive in every arena. And also the fact that Sabah and Sarawak have yet to implement the 7 days paternity leave, even for starters. Dr. Bileng, going in first now. So what has Penang's statewide approach actually been for addressing women's LFBR? And is there perhaps any data or studies that are of interest that have actually looked at getting women back to work, especially after the pandemic job losses, considering, of course, the economy in Penang, which is so vibrant, but also very much dependent on manufacturing and sectors which suffered quite deeply?
On that note, we actually tracked the female labour force participation rate even over the pandemic. In fact, surprisingly, there was no dip for Penang specifically.
Interesting.
Yes. So it was in fact in 2019 it was 54.1, and then it went up to 55.4. 2020 it was 21. It was even 57. So actually it went up.
That's interesting. And any insights around why exactly that went up? Were women joining the formal labor force or more informal work or perhaps virtual work?
Yeah. So I think on the fact that the companies or the employment, majority of them or a lot of them actually came from the MNCs. So yes, globally it is affected, but probably it was not really cascaded down to the local yet. So they are still manufacturing, there's still production, there's still designing work, and all that's still going on. So we don't really see a dip at that point. However, we also know that based on, during the pandemic, we also saw that there were a lot of families who, especially the husband and also, of course, the wife, actually lost their jobs. So we went into the sector. So when you say gender responsive, okay, we have to really look into the intersectionality of the women who are actually affected, during the pandemic. So what we did was, to get them into the formal sector, as in terms of the labor force, it is going to be very difficult. And during the lockdown, there's no way, there's no movement. So what we did was we actually innovated and come up with a program called Project Kuih Raya.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what does that entail?
So basically, we got women, especially in the B40, who actually looking in, who are home based and all that, and we get them to produce Kuih Raya.
Right.
Okay, so they produce, but outside we actually have a lot of people. Penang people are very warm and very supportive. During the MCO, they wanted to help, but they don't know how to help. So we said, okay, why don't you sponsor them? You just buy from them. So we get them to buy from these women, okay, and then where do they give the food to? To the frontliners. So there is this ecosystem
Yeah,
precisely to able to allow them to actually generate income. I think that's most important. And we were very surprised, in a matter of like 2 weeks, they earned something like 1,300. And it's so helpful, especially in a family where you're so vulnerable, the husband lost their job, because especially the B40, most of the men are actually in the labor intensive job. And that's where they lose jobs and all that because of the MCO. So I think being innovative is very important as we go in each point in wherever we are. We have to think out of the box. We have to see what are the opportunities there is, and say and don't accept that that's a fact. So same like this gender pay gap. Say okay, this is a challenge, and we have to take it.
Yes, we do. And moving into another granular data piece, and Penang, of course, has recorded a really remarkable total approved investments of close to 45 billion ringgit across various sectors. This is from January to September alone in 2023. So all of this is harboring a lot more factories, a lot more manufacturing, a lot more career opportunities. Now, what can be done, or perhaps is being done, Dato, to ensure that women are not left behind by all this abundance of career opportunities, and that there is actually space for female experts, for qualified women with all this economic development in Penang?
So manufacturing is actually one of the biggest contributor. In fact, the biggest contributor in Penang in terms of GDP. I think it is also very significant in nationwide. So that's actually where the focus. We really want more people to come into the STEM industry. Okay, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So what we see is actually the potential of looking into the talent pipeline. So talent pipeline doesn't mean that when they go into the industry, then we look at it. We have to look upstream. Okay, upstream, not just in the university, because then the question is how many women actually go, or how many girls go into university? If you look at the statistic, we see that even now tertiary education, we have 60-40. In fact, we are actually at the tipping point because there are more girls coming into the tertiary education, which is good for girls. But the question is, where are the boys? Yeah. So when we talk about gender, it's not just about women, but it's also 100%. About men. Yeah. So we should be. We are actually looking into the talent pipeline. So as we go up, then of course the university and also the industry relationship must come in very strongly to make sure that it is not just the boys, but also the girls are able to fit into the industry. And we go even higher as in terms of at what point do they decide? I stay in STEM, I stay in science. It is when they go from Form 3 to Form 4. So this is where the influence must come in to get them excited. I came from a science stream, and when science is like, wow, this is exciting, you go to the lab and do funny stuff. Where is the passion, where is the fun in science? So that's what we are trying to do. We have programs working with some of the state GLCs to come up with programs to motivate them and get them going and say that science is actually interesting and they should look at it as a career.
Absolutely, and hopefully we'll see the impacts of this within the next generation itself, because it would be very sad indeed to see all these incredible multinationals and also the Malaysian corporations opening up all across Penang, but perhaps only from thousands of workers, all the way from, the factory production line to the C-suites, you only have maybe a couple of dozen women, and those working in HR. So, Amelia, let's now, drawing from what Dato had said, focus on the legislative approach. How can a Wage Transparency Act and an Equal Pay Act actually increase employer salary transparency and help to very quickly address this gender wage gap?
Wage Transparency Act and the Equal Pay Act, or whatever name you want to come up with, I think these are strong legislative approaches, and they work hand in hand to close the gender pay gap. The way it works is usually a Wage Transparency Act would mandate employers to disclose information about salary and salary ranges to employees within the organization. So what it means is, at the point in which you want to accept a job, you can negotiate your salary better. You want to ask for promotion. If you're being given new projects, bigger responsibilities, you can now negotiate like, hey, I know the company benchmark is this, therefore I would like to negotiate a raise, for example. Equal Pay Act, on the other hand, it comes in a little later. So when there is dispute as to whether or not someone is paid equitably, you can then bring these complaints and hear your cases out through the legal avenues that will be made available through the Act, right? But one thing to note here, if you have both of these things available, it doesn't just benefit women, it also benefits men, it would also benefit persons with disabilities in the workforce, because now people who do the same work will know and can fight for equal salary that that they deserve. And in the context of the workplace, there are a few legal avenues that I would like to mention.
Yes,
so, for example, in the UK and Germany, on top of just mandating that companies disclose the range of salary, employers are also actually mandated to disclose pay gap analysis between genders within their respective organization. So you're not just reporting numbers blindly, you're actually looking at
analyzing the
correct.
data.
You're looking at granular information between job levels, age groups, qualifications, for example, and you're making all this information readily available for the people within the organization. This is important because you're not just achieving transparency, but also accountability on the part of the employer. In Australia, the equal pay laws create a specific commission or a tribunal which hears unequal pay complaints or would resolve disputes on the issue. In the US, I quite like the structure here. So they have legal avenues like civil lawsuits, and you will have class action lawsuits, for example. But on top of that, they actually have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that actually has investigative powers to look into all these complaints of discrimination in terms of pay and other forms of discrimination. And on top of that, they have a government agency that monitors compliance amongst this organization, and can also provide guidance. Let's say you have a big organization, they don't quite know how to close the pay gap within the organization. You can reach out to this to the government agency, and they'll come in, they'll sort of like guide and help you out throughout that process. And finally, in Iceland, on top of the equal pay law, they introduced an equal pay certification. Now this is interesting because they now have to provide evidence to get a certification to say that, hey, we pay equal pay between the genders at our workforce. And the result that has been seen from this is that people will gravitate towards company that has the certification as opposed to working for organizations that don't have the certification, because people will know that, hey, you don't pay equitably. That means I don't have a good career prospects here. I might not be paid well.
Even
and
as a
therefore,
man, not just as a woman.
even as a man, correct. So all of this are kind of legal avenues that can come from both of these pieces of legislation. And if you were to implement something like that in Malaysia, I think it's important to go beyond a prohibition, which is usually where we're stuck at. So the law will say, oh, you have to pay equal, everyone receives equal pay. But what are the legal avenues? What are the protection?
Redress,
Can
yes.
someone be, taken off the workforce completely if they lodge a complaint and stuff like that, right? So the protection and access to the legal avenues are also extremely important.
Absolutely. It also reminds me of the fact that, when it comes to the gender wage gap also, yes, research actually shows that the motherhood penalty reduces over time. This has come from Nobel Prize winner Claudia Goldin for the Economics Prize. Her research that shows that, yes, motherhood penalty reduces, but there's also a fatherhood premium. Yes. So these are also wider issues that need to be discussed. Very briefly, Amelia, if you could perhaps touch on maybe a Gender Equality Act for Malaysia that has also been in the works. Could this also then contribute to looking and addressing this very serious gender pay gap, regardless of whether or not it actually is 33.33% as reported by DOSM, or as Dr. Zaizi has more empirically analyzed, it is definitely increasing year on year.
When we look at the Gender Equality Act, it's important to first identify what part of equality are we talking about.
Right.
Because we don't want to just talk about basic access to, for example, like safety issues, violence issues. Those are important. But also economic independence is, like I said earlier, one of the most important things that has to be highlighted here. So if Malaysia were to revisit this, I think it would be such a milestone for us. And the best part is it could provide guidance to employers and people in the workforce in general on how can you sort of like close the gap. And we see this positive trend after the recent amendments to the Employment Act. Because the recent amendments provided very specific guidance. You have to put up notices on sexual harassment, for example. You have to provide training. You have to have mechanisms and things like that. What I've seen in the Malaysian workforce, be it on the GLC side, MNCs, or even SME, employers now know what to do.
Yeah, so they are responding, they are reacting, they are actually looking for programs to
Correct.
advise them.
Because I think the assumption here is not that they don't want to do it, but sometimes they just don't know how to go about it. So if the Gender Equality Act were to be put in place, I would like to see more guidance on this as well.
Fantastic. And Dr. Saizi, from there, let's quickly delve into why exactly female-dominated industries and jobs attract lower wages. What are some historic or systemic reasons behind this?
I think historically there, because not about the value of the women compared to the men, or the value of the care works has been done, usually mainly produced by women, has been devaluated. I think this is one of the historical reasons. Another reason just now has been touch based by the Amelia is when we're talking about negotiation, when the policy or the regulations has not been strongly enforced, how can we negotiate with our employer? But historically, for those women-concentrated industries, there has been always lack of the collective bargaining power for those kind of industries. Yeah. So I think in terms of historical, these are the key reasons for that. But also when we are talking about the occupational segregation, we can see that the discrimination which is always happening in the labor market is very difficult for women to be employed in the management level. That is why we always see for some of the listed companies in the board members, they are always a old boys club. Yeah, but I think many of the countries, including Malaysia, we have been putting effort on that. That's why in the budget of 2 years ago, we have already studied to request that for the listed company in Malaysia, we have should have at least one female board members. Yeah, so but I think we should also try to think about, instead of putting a very compulsory policy or regulations for the companies to implement, we also should think about comparing between you have to do this compared to if you do this, what kind of the incentives or benefits you could get. If we can provide some more tax incentives for the companies, if they do implement a more gender balanced policies, what kind of the incentives or tax reimbursement they can get. I think there are more companies who will be willing to do so. So I think the jump from the progress of narrowing down the gender pay gap, especially in the industry level, among the stakeholders, we could be improved a lot.
Absolutely. It's all about also getting to that point in your career where you are being paid more, and that happens to men far more commonly than women. I think it's also been interesting that, of course, because of work by, for example, a 30% club, etc., public listed companies in Malaysia, at least the top 100, they do have their 30% representation, but there's still about 800, 900 companies on the board, right? And there's at least about 20, 30 of the largest companies that do not even have one single woman on their board. Very interesting data. Amelia, from there, looking at, of course, the fact that career gaps, there are significantly at play in what perpetuates a gender pay gap for women across the life cycle as a working adult. Let's also talk about what role organizations can play to bring women back into work, especially women who have taken career breaks for child raising, for elderly care, etc. And what are some immediate recommendations for the corporate sector?
I think the first thing is always a returnship program, like Datuk mentioned. Returnship program is actually extremely lucrative. There's a huge business case behind this. That shows that you actually can reduce costs like recruitment costs, onboarding costs and things like that if you bring back women into the workforce, because they're experienced, they know the trade well, they just took a break. And to achieve that double peak that we have talked about, I think businesses have to put in a returnship program. So what should be in this returnship program? I think the first one is also, like Doctor mentioned, is flexible work arrangements. It's extremely important because it allows people to kind of like arrange their work hours around their other obligations. And I want to make this point because flexible work arrangement is not just for women in the workforce. It should be for men, their fathers, their husbands. They have care work to be done at home. And if this is available, we've seen trends in the more modern couples, modern marriages, where they take turns doing it. If flexible work arrangement is made available to both men and women in the workforce. The second thing is paternity leave. And we've seen a slight pushback on paternity leave once the increase was made last year.
Yes,
and organizations said, oh, now we don't want to hire women because I have to give such a long break. And this is some of the things you get when you put the entirety of that burden of, caregiving to women. So to increase paternity leave and paternity benefit, or I would advise you to actually go for parental benefits. In fact, that would actually help. For organization, an immediate thing that you can also do is to put on-site childcare facilities. Let's not wait for the government to do that, because you want your workforce to be able to work with a peace of mind. Husbands or wives, mums or dads, if they can bring their child to work and sort of like they know their kids is downstairs, they can work at peace. It actually increases productivity. There's also a lot of research around that. And lastly, I have to mention this one because you have to talk about a more inclusive workplace environment to actually even encourage women to come back to the workplace, because you don't want to create a hostile work environment. The problem with the gender pay gap is it sends a message to everyone in the workforce that women are less than. They are not as smart, they are not as competent, and therefore deserving less respect in the workplace, which is not true, because we know that academically they are more qualified, right? So when you manage to address all these microaggressions in the workplace, sexual harassment, subconscious biases and all of that, it actually make women want to come back to work as well. So for organizations, there's a lot of things that they can do. They don't have to wait for the government to come up with all the laws to mandate it, because there's a huge business case around it. Again, it is extremely lucrative to bring women back into the workforce.
Exactly. Thank you very much for highlighting that, because it just reminded me that middle of last year, before the cabinet reshuffle, the Ministry of Human Resources had very gladly announced that 1,000 companies have signed up for flexible work options for women. So once again, it brings to note the fact that it actually needs to be for parents, not just for women. All right. So as we move towards closing out the discussion, Bileng, can I quickly ask you to share your thoughts regarding, of course, Penang's great strides and also commitment to ensuring more proportional female political representation, as well as implementing gender-responsive financing in the state budget, because all of this eventually is going to lead into closing this gender pay gap.
Actually, on that note, when we talk about gender pay gap, it's actually one of the sub-index when you talk about economic empowerment.
Yes.
But when you talk about the gender gap itself, I think we have to look at it holistically, because they are interrelated, and to a certain extent they are intercausal, because one can cause the other. In Penang, what we do is we look into the three-pronged approach. Okay, the first one is looking into institutionalization, and I totally agree that we should have some laws in place to push this matter forward, because otherwise, if we wait for companies or we wait for the employers to make a move, it will take some time. But it's always the law, or through a policy, or through guidelines that things change. So in Penang, we actually have what we call the gender inclusiveness policy, whereby in it we also look into the budgeting. We follow the money. Where's the money? Yeah. Sure. So this is where we look into gender responsive and participatory budgeting, where we take a top-down approach as well as a bottom-up. That means we want people to participate on how budget is made, or how budget is allocated.
Absolutely. And the second and the third points, quite briefly, Bileng?
Okay, so that is institutionalization, through policies, through structures and mechanism, and even to the 30% and all that, actually is incorporated in the state policies. The other one is actually on the part about creating enabling platform. Having a law policy doesn't make things happen. You have to have action taken. So it's through platforms, it should be programs and all that, projects, so to get it moving. And third but not least is, of course, changing the mindset. How do we make the mindset shift? And this is where we talk about the gender stereotypes, unconscious bias. So I always tell people, maybe it's there, you just don't realize you did it. So you don't make them feel so guilty.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So thank you so very much, Amelia, Dr. Saizi, and Dr. Bileng, for this fantastic discussion. Now, in conclusion, I would like to conclude by highlighting the World Bank's 2019 Breaking Barriers report for Malaysia, which showed that if all economic barriers are removed for women in Malaysia, the country's income per capita, just for women, per capita could grow by 26.2%, i.e. an average annual income gain of 9,400 ringgit. Cost of living crisis? Yes, indeed. And we have to close the gender pay gap for meaningful national economic development and growth for the rakyat. We look forward to a response from the Ministry of Economy, as DOSM's published gender pay gap requires immediate public engagement as well as policy action. DOSM did not respond to several requests for this interview. Well, that's all we have time for on this episode of Niaga Spotlight. We'll see you again next Friday with more business analysis and insights. I'm Tamina Kausji, signing off for now, wishing everyone a productive week ahead.